This HOA Karen called 911 on my so-called illegal lakeside cabbing, completely unaware that I own the dock permits her $50 million neighborhood depends on to function. It's 6:00 a.m., and I'm sipping coffee on my Lake Clearwater dock when a police cruiser pulls up, with Linda right behind in designer athleisure, shrieking about my grandfather's 75-year-old cabin, destroying property values. She'd already slapped me with $25,000 in bogus fines, assuming a 30-year electrician couldn't understand property law. But my 1947 deed gives me legal control over every single dock in her precious community, and she's been collecting illegal fees for decades. Tonight, I'm revoking every dock permit and revealing 30 years of fraud in front of the entire neighborhood. Ever dreamed of completely dismantling an HOA tyrant? This is how I did it. But first, let me tell you how it all began. My name's Jake Morrison, I'm 52, and until recently, I was just a retired electrician trying to rebuild life after a messy divorce. You know how it goes. Sometimes you need a project to keep your hands busy while your heart heals. 8 months ago, I inherited my grandfather's fishing cabin on Lake Clearwater, Michigan. It's not a luxury property, more of a genuine 1940s fishing shack, built by Grandpa himself right after the war. The place smelled like cedar shavings and old varnish, had more personality than a Hemingway novel, and sat on the most beautiful slice of shoreline you could imagine. My plan was simple: restore the cabin on weekends, maybe rent it to fishermen, and teach my grandson to cast a line where 4 generations of Morrison men had learned the same skill. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. That's when I met Linda Ashworth. She's 48, drives a spotless white Mercedes SUV, and happens to be the president of the Clearwater Shores Premium Community HOA, formed in 1995 when the lake got surrounded by McMansions worth $800,000 each. She's got a real estate background, a bank VP husband, and that kind of smile you've seen before. Sweet as pie until you cross her. The first time we met, I was sanding planks on the dock, feeling smooth river rocks under my boots where Grandpa built his pathway. The sunrise was perfect, the water like glass, then came the click, click, click of heels on wood. Welcome to the neighborhood, Linda chirped, her eyes already scanning my place for flaws. I stood up, brushed off the sawdust, and tried to be friendly. Morning, ma'am. Beautiful day, isn't it? Oh yes, gorgeous, she replied, before instantly switching gears. I'm Linda Ashworth, HOA president. I wanted to chat with you about bringing your property up to community standards. I'd been around long enough to spot a player. The way she said property, like it was contaminated, that fake smile told me everything. Well, Linda, I appreciate the concern, but this cabin was built in 1947, long before the HOA existed. I pulled the original building permit from my back pocket. I'd started carrying it after a few neighbors gave me funny looks. Everything's legal and grandfathered. That's when her mask slipped. That old shack doesn't belong here anymore. Our community has standards, and frankly, it's lowering property values. I kept my tone even. Ma'am, I don't think you understand the situation. She stepped closer, perfume mixing with the lake breeze. Oh, I understand perfectly. You have 2 choices. Bring that cabin up to our standards, or we'll find a way to remove it. This is a premium neighborhood, Mr. Morrison, and we intend to keep it that way. Here's the thing about people like Linda. They rely on intimidation, assuming the average person can't fight back. But my grandfather wasn't just a fisherman. He was meticulous. He read every contract, kept every receipt, and saved every document that could matter someday. He taught me that patience and preparation beat threats every time. Linda, I said, taking a sip of coffee while a great blue heron fished in the shallows, I think you're about to learn something interesting about this old place. She didn't waste time making good on her threat. 3 days later, the county building department showed up. I was installing new cleats on the dock when the inspector arrived, clipboard in hand, wearing an expression that said he'd already made up his mind. Jake Morrison, I'm here about a complaint regarding unpermitted structures on this property. The complaint was on official HOA letterhead, signed by Linda, accusing my cabin of violating lake setback requirements and having dangerous, unpermitted modifications. The inspector took photos, but only of the cabin's rough exterior, not its rock-solid foundation or careful restoration. That was Linda's first mistake. 30 years as an electrician teaches you a lot about permits and how to keep paperwork airtight. I went to my truck, pulled out Grandpa's old olive green metal filing box, still smelling faintly of old paper, and laid out the original survey maps, 1947 building permits, and county correspondence. All pristine, chronological, and stamped with official seals. The inspector's demeanor flipped. "Sir, your paperwork's actually better than most new construction." That's when I casually mentioned something I'd noticed during my morning coffee. "While you're here, you might want to check some of those newer properties, especially Linda's. Her deck extends about 3 feet past the property line." Sure enough, he added it to his violation list that same afternoon. Linda's spotless deck now required either a $15,000 engineering report or full removal to comply with setback rules. Hearing her Mercedes sputter in my driveway later that night was almost as satisfying as the base I'd fried for dinner. But Linda wasn't done, far from it. That weekend my neighbor Earl, a 78-year-old retired machinist who knew Grandpa well, stopped by with a six-pack and some stories. "Your granddad was smart as a whip," Earl said, settling into an old Adirondack chair. "He knew they'd try to develop this lake someday, so he made sure to protect what mattered." Meanwhile, Linda started her smear campaign, a Facebook group called Protecting Our Community Standards, filled with unflattering photos of my cabin and captions about preserving property values. She had a knack for twisting restoration into decay. I ignored it. Social media drama wasn't my game. I had more important work, digging through Grandpa's archives. Some newer residents whispered support when they saw me at the hardware store, but wouldn't speak up publicly. Nobody wanted to cross the HOA president. The old-timers, though, remembered the lake before property values took priority, and they started saying so out loud. Linda's deck violation was just the beginning. Funny thing about rules, they cut both ways. When you insist on strict enforcement, sometimes you end up breaking your own. Every evening, the sound of my cordless drill over the water became my meditation. Each board I replaced honored Grandpa's legacy and drove another nail into Linda's assumption that I'd give up. But I could feel the storm coming. She wasn't the type to retreat, especially after being embarrassed. If anything, I just made her more dangerous. HOA members got a formal notice about an emergency meeting to address so-called non-conforming structures threatening our community. Linda had even invited her tennis partner, City Councilman Bradley Walsh, to discuss what she called urgent property enforcement concerns. The meeting was on a Thursday night in the community center, and Linda showed up armed with a PowerPoint presentation that could have impressed a corporate legal team. She had charts on property values, photos of my cabin taken from the most unflattering angles possible, and a proposal for a special assessment to hire specialized legal counsel for enforcement, which was code for getting every homeowner to fund her personal campaign against me. The kicker, she was passing around a petition demanding that I either remove the cabin completely or pay a $50,000 compliance fine to bring it up to her idea of community standards. While Linda was busy playing politics, I was busy playing detective. The next morning, I headed to the county courthouse, a beautiful old brick building with a basement records room that smelled like decades of forgotten paperwork. I spent 3 full days down there, combing through property files that went back to the 1920s, tracing every deed, every easement, every scrap of legal history tied to Lake Clearwater. The rubber taste of courthouse vending machine coffee barely registered. I was too focused on what I'd just uncovered. I already knew Grandpa had sold off most of his lakefront land to developers in 1994. What I didn't know was the hidden condition he'd buried in that sale. In the original easement deed, brittle 1940s paper tucked inside a protective sleeve, was a clause that changed everything. Grandpa hadn't just kept access to the dock. He'd kept ownership of the actual dock structure itself, selling only the usage rights to the development company. That meant every single boat slip the HOA residents were renting for $2,000 a month required written permission from the Morrison family, that is, from me. Linda had been collecting dock fees without legal authority for decades. Walking out of that musty basement, documents in hand, I realized I was holding a legal nuke disguised as a yellowed piece of paper. Still, I wasn't going to detonate it without giving diplomacy a chance. I made an appointment with the HOA attorney, a sharply dressed man in his 50s, who probably billed more in an hour than I made in a week. In his polished mahogany, paneled office, I slid the easement deed across his desk. Not disputes. I told him evenly, clarifications. He read it once, twice, then reached for his reading glasses and read it a third time. His face went pale. This is actually ironclad. I told him I wasn't looking for trouble, just to restore my cabin in peace. But you might want to inform Mrs. Ashworth about the dock ownership situation before things escalate further. He nodded slowly, clearly calculating liability and fallout. I'll need to discuss this with the board immediately. Word travels fast in small communities, especially when it involves lawyers going pale. That evening, Earl stopped by with updates from the old-timer network. Hardware store owner says Linda tried to get you banned from buying supplies. He chuckled, settling into his porch chair. And the marina owner says she's been claiming dock ownership for insurance purposes. Holding those old documents, smelling the age and the weight of them, I could almost hear the cracks forming in Linda's carefully constructed empire. Her public stance was pure denial. Some old papers don't override modern property law. She told anyone who would listen. But Earl's sources said she was privately panicking over potential financial liability for all those dock fees she'd pocketed. Here's what I learned that every waterfront property owner should know. Easement and usage rights can override HOA authority. Always check original development agreements before you buy. By the end of the week, Linda was telling people she'd fight this in court if necessary. She was doubling down, just as I expected. But she didn't realize I was only getting started, and that unlike her bluster, everything I had was backed by decades of legal precedent. The dock fees, just the tip of the iceberg. Her next move was to claim my dock repairs violated historical waterfront preservation. That was rich, considering her own neighborhood had paved over half the natural shoreline for their boat slips. She filed a complaint with the state environmental agency, alleging I was making unpermitted modifications that threatened the ecosystem. She even rallied the HOA board to threaten a lawsuit for diminished property values. Though half the board was beginning to look uneasy with her aggressive tactics, then came the rumors, whispers about my suspicious daily activities at the cabin. According to the coffee shop gossip mill, I was either running an illegal business, hiding divorce assets, or, my favorite, operating a meth lab disguised as a fishing cabin. I responded the way Grandpa taught me, methodically, with documentation. Every interaction was photographed and time-stamped. Every conversation recorded, perfectly legal in Michigan with one-party consent. When my tools began disappearing, I installed a high-end security camera system. On the morning of the environmental inspection, I was ready with fresh coffee and every environmental permit in existence. What Linda hadn't bothered to learn was that Grandpa had filed a voluntary conservation easement back in 1950 to protecting more shoreline than modern regulations required. My cabin's footprint was smaller than a suburban garage, and my repairs were using eco-friendly materials. Meanwhile, the inspector noticed 3 HOA properties with landscaping pushed right to the water's edge, using non-native plants and fertilizers, a direct violation. When Linda showed up an hour later, expecting vindication, the inspector told her plainly, "Your community is the one with environmental violations, not Mr. Morrison." The real gem, though, came from my cameras, footage of Linda's teenage son spray painting "Go Home" on my cabin at 2 a.m., Linda herself in dark clothes pulling up my property markers, and most damning, Linda meeting with an unknown man, handing him what looked like cash, then pointing toward my cabin. I didn't call the police yet. Instead, I sent the footage to the HOA attorney as evidence of ongoing harassment. That evening, campfire smoke drifted over the lake while I installed motion-activated floodlights. Earl introduced me to other property owners with their own Linda stories. The fishing guide started sending customers my way for lake access. Even the county inspector became an unofficial ally after admitting she'd filed 17 complaints in 2 years, 16 baseless. "We're starting to flag her calls," he said off the record, but Linda's smear tactics continued. She organized a community safety meeting about transient cabin dwellers of me, despite owning the place. She got her book club friend at the local paper to run a piece hinting at suspicious activity. Her next-door posts painted me as a dangerous, unpermitted business owner, attracting unsavory characters, and threatening children's safety. She even tried to pressure the marina into revoking my boat launch rights. Through it all, I stayed patient. What Grandpa called strategic patience. I kept restoring the cabin, documenting every step, building relationships with reasonable residents, and letting Linda overplay her hand while I stacked evidence. Then came the real bombshell. On a rainy Saturday, insulating the cabin's crawl space, a job I'd avoided for months, I knocked my elbow against something metal wedged between floor joists. After some effort, I pulled out a smaller, carefully wrapped metal box. Inside, preserved in oilcloth like pirate treasure, was the original 1994 sale contract between Grandpa and Clearwater Development Corp. Not just any contract, the master agreement with clauses I'd never seen. My hands shook as I read it. Grandpa hadn't only kept dock ownership, he'd retained approval authority over every single water permit on the entire lake. Every dock, seawall, and water structure in the HOA required written consent from the Morrison family. Linda and her neighbors had been operating under fraudulent permits for 30 years. I sat at Grandpa's old kitchen table, rain drumming on the tin roof, reading it over and over. The scope was staggering. Grandpa had built a legal safeguard against overdevelopment, disguised as a sale. The next morning, I drove straight to my attorney. After 20 minutes of reviewing the document, he looked up. "Why, died. This is extraordinary leverage. You could revoke all dock privileges immediately. Any property sale needing dock access would require your approval. Market rate $4,000 a month per slip, easily. That's worth over $2 million to this community. But going nuclear would hurt innocent neighbors. Homeowners who'd bought here in good faith, elderly retirees who'd saved their entire lives for a peaceful lakefront retirement, young families who just wanted a safe place to raise their kids. What Linda had been doing wasn't justice, it was just revenge. That evening, I sat on the dock, watching the sunset turn the water to molten gold and orange, trying to process the full magnitude of Grandpa's foresight. He hadn't protected this lake out of spite. He'd done it with legal cleverness and a deep sense of responsibility. He'd given his descendants the means to preserve what truly mattered without destroying what was good. Across the water, the loons called to one another, their haunting voices echoing off the hills just as they had for generations, long before the McMansions, before the HOA, before Linda's petty power games. This wasn't about dock fees, property values, or community standards. This was about stewardship, real stewardship. That night, with my coffee cooling beside me and the first stars starting to prick the darkening sky, I made my decision. I'd use this leverage not for profit, but for resolution. I would force Linda's resignation, establish a truce, and protect the lake for future generations. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Linda's authority was built on decades of illegally collected fees and fraudulent permits. The truth was, the community's property values now depended on my good will, not her intimidation. She didn't know that yet, but she would. Here's something every waterfront property buyer should know. Original developers sometimes leave hidden legal control mechanisms buried in old records. If you don't comb through every historical document before buying, you might miss something critical. And yes, run a non-optional year-round history check. The next phase required meticulous planning, trusted allies, and flawless timing. When you're holding a legal nuclear weapon, the hardest part isn't pulling the trigger, it's knowing when to use it. My preparation was methodical enough to make a military strategist proud. This wasn't just about winning a case, it was about restructuring a community's power dynamics from the ground up. Earl became my unofficial campaign manager, dropping by every evening with intel from the old-timer network. Linda borrowed against her dock permit for a home equity loan last year. He told me one morning, sliding into his now regular porch chair, bank needed proof of permanent water access for approval. That was leverage. Dave, the marina owner, provided detailed records of dock fee payments that didn't add up. Some residents paid Linda directly, others paid the HOA, and nobody seemed sure who actually owned what. Mike, my county inspector friend, shared off the record insights. 90% of Linda's complaints were baseless, and multiple agencies had flagged her as a frequent complaint source. We still have to investigate, he said, but when her name shows up, we roll our eyes first. My attorney assembled a response package worthy of the Supreme Court. Every threat, false claim, and harassment incident meticulously documented and backed by ironclad historical evidence. My settlement proposal was simple. I'd grant permanent dock easements to all current residents in exchange for formal recognition of my cabin's protected status and Linda's immediate resignation from any lake-related authority. The financial math was staggering. Over the past 5 years, Linda's HOA had raked in roughly $180,000 in illegal dock fees. In today's market, equivalent lake access rights could sell for $500,000 and up. My approval rights were conservatively worth $2 million to the community. I didn't want the money, I wanted the principle. Local fishing guides rallied to my side, ready to testify about the cabin's historical value and minimal environmental impact. I organized every scrap of documentation chronologically, built a visual property timeline for non-lawyers, and prepared environmental reports proving the cabin's footprint was smaller than most community garages. I logged every act of harassment with timestamps, witnesses, and photos, clear evidence of an escalating campaign to force me out through intimidation and legal attrition. I also prepared mentally. I practiced calm, factual delivery in the mirror, ready for Linda's inevitable emotional theatrics. I studied HOA rhetoric so I could dismantle her arguments in real time. Late at night, I'd sit in Grandpa's old leather chair, the air still carrying traces of pipe smoke, rehearsing responses until they were second nature. The timing strategy was everything. I'd wait for Linda to call another emergency meeting. She thrived on grand gestures. I'd let her speak first, then calmly destroy her points with documented facts. My community benefit plan tied it all together, using reclaimed dock fees to fund lake conservation, annual water testing, invasive species control, scholarships for local students, and modernized, eco-friendly dock improvements for elderly residents. Knowledge nuggets worth noting. County courthouse records can reveal hidden rights that trump HOA bylaws, protect critical documents in fireproof, waterproof storage, and sometimes the best defense is realizing you don't need one. You hold all the cards. By then, I was ready for anything Linda could throw at me, and throw she did. Her reaction to learning I'd been meeting with an attorney was instant and explosive. She called an emergency HOA meeting to approve a $100,000 legal defense fund, funded by a special $3,000 assessment per homeowner. That cabin owner could destroy all our property values, she warned, spinning panic like a seasoned politician. Within days, 3 homeowners received payment demands with threats of property liens if they refused. Linda had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Meanwhile, my security cameras began capturing gold. First, her landscaper, later admitting she paid him $200 to dump yard waste near my cabin at midnight to make it look like I attracted trash. Then came a flood of bogus agency complaints. Health, fire, zoning, environmental, each investigation ending in nothing wrong, but costing me time. Inspectors even started noticing the identical handwriting on different complaints. She pressured the marina owner to revoke my boat launch access, claiming I was hostile toward families and threatening to organize a boycott. But her worst mistake came when my cameras caught her teenage son and 2 friends trying to cut my dock lines. More damning still was footage of Linda herself at 11 p.m., yanking up my property markers and later handing cash to an unknown man while pointing toward my cabin in a way that was clearly threatening. I didn't call the police yet. Instead, I delivered the footage straight to the HOA attorney. The moment he saw her destroying property on video, his face went pale. "Mr. Morrison, I need to strongly advise my client to cease all contact with you and your property." But Linda was far beyond listening to legal advice. She'd reached that dangerous point where pride and panic steamroll common sense. She organized what she called a community safety patrol. Basically a band of volunteers who trailed me around the lake during my fishing trips, snapping invasive photos and recording my so-called suspicious activities. These activities included fishing, repairing my dock, and drinking my morning coffee on my own porch. The harassment became so brazen she even filed for a restraining order, claiming I had threatened her during a grocery store encounter. The problem was, my phone had recorded the entire conversation, which consisted of me saying "Good morning, Linda," and her responding with a 5-minute rant about property values. The judge dismissed her request and warned her about filing false reports. A tip for any property owner: document every harassment incident with timestamps and witnesses. Repeated false reporting can legally backfire on the instigator. The community was beginning to fracture along predictable lines. 3 HOA board members quietly resigned rather than support Linda's increasingly erratic crusade. Several homeowners refused to pay the special assessment without seeing actual legal justification. Earl's network of informants reported that Linda's husband was urging her to take a vacation until things cooled down. Apparently, his bank was becoming uneasy with the negative publicity surrounding his wife's campaign. The sound of my power tools during evening cabin work had become a sort of meditation, steady, purposeful, unstoppable. The scent of fresh pine boards replacing rotted siding mixed with the taste of inevitable justice in the crisp autumn air. But Linda wasn't finished. I could feel her final escalation building like a storm front over the water. People like her never retreat gracefully when they're losing control. They double down, usually in spectacular fashion. I was ready for whatever came. My documentation was airtight, my legal footing rocks, solid, and my patience about to pay off in ways she couldn't imagine. Linda's last push was like watching someone pour gasoline onto a fire while standing too close. It began with actual bribery, honest-to-goodness bribery. My friend Mike, a county inspector, called to say she'd approached him after a community event, offering what she called a consulting fee. If he could dig up code violations on my cabin. She pulled an envelope of cash right there in the Methodist church parking lot, claiming it was payment for a thorough inspection. Mike reported her to the county ethics office that same afternoon. Next, she tried to buy off the marina owner with an exclusive HOA contract worth $50,000 a year if he banned me from the boat launch permanently. Dave recorded the entire conversation on his phone and played it for me over coffee that evening. In it, she said, "We need to make his life so difficult that he just gives up and leaves." Dave shook his head, chuckling. Apparently, she didn't realize that's a legal conspiracy. Her desperation peaked when she contacted an environmental group with fabricated claims that I was polluting the lake with illegal runoff. She doctored photos to make my restoration materials look like industrial waste and sent them to 3 different agencies. Investigators arrived expecting to find an ecological disaster, but instead discovered that Linda's own property had multiple violations: fertilizer runoff, non-native landscaping planted to the water's edge, and a decorative fount, and illegally drawing lake water without a permit. The intimidation spread beyond me to anyone who'd shown support. Linda began threatening friendly neighbors with HOA violations for petty things: mailbox placement, garden borders, even front door colors. That backfired fast. Nothing turns people against a bully like seeing them abuse power against the innocent. My anonymous support network grew stronger. Someone left fresh garden vegetables on my porch each morning. A mystery supporter paid my marina fees after Linda pressured them to cancel me. The hardware store quietly upgraded my orders at no charge. One unsigned note tucked under my windshield read, Most of us are rooting for you. Don't let her win. Linda's public behavior was spiraling. Earl saw her in a screaming match with an HOA board member at the post office, accusing them of being traitors to community security. She even threatened to sue the local paper for bias, though they had reported only verified facts. Meanwhile, her husband's suggestion that she take a vacation grew more urgent as her crusade drew the wrong kind of attention from his bank's board of directors. The investigation's momentum had moved beyond her control. The newspaper uncovered systematic permit irregularities throughout the HOA. The county audited all her filed complaints and found 90% baseless. The state environmental agency opened a formal case for repeated false reporting. The sheriff's department flagged her address as a frequent source of unfounded calls, 17 in 2 months. My final preparations were meticulous. Every document was filed in professional binders. Every incident was time-stamped and backed by witnesses. My security system now live, streamed for both protection and evidence. My attorney confirmed our case was bulletproof. My community allies stood ready to testify. Media contacts were lined up for after the reveal. The most important preparation, though, was mental. I spent evenings on Grandpa's dock, watching sunsets paint the water gold and crimson, reflecting on the responsibility that came with the power I held. The autumn air tasted of wood smoke, geese called overhead heading south. The solid planks beneath my feet now belonged to me, not the HOA. Linda was engineering her own downfall with precision. The storm broke when she called one last emergency HOA meeting to resolve the cabin issue permanently. She promised shocking revelations about my illegal occupation and demanded a community vote to take all legal action to remove me from the lake. She invited city council members, a county commissioner, the press, and promised a damning presentation to expose me as a threat. The fact that saved me, false reporting to government agencies, can bring criminal charges and civil liability. Always verify before you file. Linda was about to learn that the hard way in front of everyone who mattered. The community center was packed beyond the community center, reached full capacity that Thursday evening. Over 100 residents filled the chairs, lined the walls, and spilled into the hallway. The air was heavy with tension and the buzz of people sensing they were about to witness something important. Linda entered dressed for battle, wearing a designer navy suit that likely cost more than my monthly mortgage. Hair perfectly styled, and radiating the confidence of someone convinced she was about to deliver a decisive blow. She'd brought an array of props, an easel with poster boards, a laptop for her presentation, and a thick stack of documents hefty enough to wedge a door open. The local newspaper reporter sat front row with a photographer. County Commissioner Sarah Rodriguez had driven in from the county seat. City Councilman Bradley Walsh, Linda's tennis partner, looked uneasy but stayed. Even a few folks from nearby lake communities had shown up, lured by the gossip. I arrived early, taking a seat in the back with nothing but a single manila folder and the quiet certainty of someone holding all the winning cards. Linda took the podium with the grandeur of an award recipient. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we're going to resolve a threat that's been hanging over our community for months. This illegal cabin operation has gone on long enough. Her PowerPoint was a display in manipulation, charts showing declining property values, carefully framed photos making my cabin appear derelict, dramatic quotes about community standards and protecting investments. Mr. Morrison's so-called cabin violates dozens of current regulations and threatens everyone's property values. Tonight, I'm asking for authorization to take immediate legal action to remove this blight from our lake. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and a few residents voiced concerns about my supposed aggression and disregard for community rules. Linda's supporters were loud and assured. Earl rose from the middle section. Now hold on, Linda. Jake's grandfather built that cabin before most of us even knew this lake existed. Some respect for history might be in order. Linda shot back. History doesn't override property law, Earl. We live in a modern community with modern standards. That's when Commissioner Rodriguez asked the question that shifted everything. Mr. Morrison, would you like to respond to these allegations? I stood slowly, folder in hand, walking to the front as the room fell silent. The hum of fluorescent lights and someone's nervous breathing in the front row were the only sounds. "Thank you, Commissioner Rodriguez. I appreciate the chance to clear up a few misconceptions." I opened the folder and drew out a single sheet, the original 1994 development contract. "I've come across some interesting historical documents that I believe everyone should hear about." Linda's face drained of color as I placed it on the podium and adjusted the microphone. "This is the original development agreement between my grandfather and Clearwater Development Corporation, dated March 15, 1994. It contains provisions that might surprise you." I read one clause slowly, clearly. "Morrison family designate retains ownership and approval authority over all lake access structures, including but not limited to docks, boat slips, and water permits within the development boundaries." The silence deepened. "What this means," I continued, "is that every dock permit in this community has been technically invalid for 30 years. Every boat slip rental, dock fee, and water access right requires written approval from the Morrison family designate, which would be me." Linda shot up from her seat. "Those are fake documents, fraud. Commissioner, arrest this man immediately." Rodriguez examined the contract with the practiced eye of someone used to official papers. "Mr. Morrison, this appears to be authentic. The seals and signatures look legitimate." "They are legitimate," I replied calmly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone or take anything away from this community. In fact, I've prepared an easement agreement granting permanent dock rights to all current residents." I held up the pre-written agreement. "My only request is peaceful coexistence and an end to the harassment I've endured. I also propose redirecting current dock fees into a community lake conservation fund." Linda's breakdown was something to behold. She hurled accusations at me, the commissioner, the reporter, and even her own allies. "This is a conspiracy. He forged those papers. Someone paid him to destroy our community." Security escorted her out as she raged about lawsuits and fraud, shouting that people like me didn't belong here. Her husband trailed behind. She apologized to everyone within earshot, but the community's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Residents lined up to shake my hand and express regret for Linda's behavior. HOA board members discussed her immediate resignation, and the reporter interviewed me about my restraint and generous offer. "I just want healing and cooperation," I told her, "not revenge." The aftermath came faster than a Michigan spring thaw. Linda's resignation from the HOA board was accepted unanimously during an emergency meeting 3 days later. The new board president, retired teacher Margaret Chen, issued a public apology to me and the community for what she called months of needless conflict and harassment. Within a week, I had signed permanent easement agreements for every dock slip in the development. Around $180,000 in legal dock fees Linda had collected over the years was transferred into the newly formed Lake Clearwater Conservation Fund. Finally, something good had come out of all that chaos. Linda's troubles didn't stop there. The county ethics investigation fined her $5,000 for attempting to bribe a public official. She was ordered to cover my attorney's fees $12,000 as part of the harassment settlement. Her husband's bank quietly reassigned him to a branch 2 counties away to dodge the scandal. Their house was sold within 6 months, the sign going up and coming down faster than anyone expected. In a small town, when you've made that many enemies, starting over somewhere else becomes appealing. But this story isn't about her fall, it's about what happened next. The first annual Grandfather Morrison Lake Cleanup Day drew over 50 volunteers. We removed invasive plants, restored native shoreline vegetation, and put up educational signs about protecting the lake's ecosystem. The Conservation Fund paid for all of it, and the sense of pride in the crisp morning air was almost tangible. Our fishing tournament raised $8,000 for a veteran's mental health program, something Grandpa would have cherished as a veteran himself. Local businesses donated prizes, and even some of Linda's former supporters helped with the barbecue. Restoring my cabin became a symbol of honoring history while building for the future. I used sustainable materials and traditional craftsmanship, creating a retreat that felt as though it had always belonged there. The scent of cedar, the call of loons at dawn, the solid workmanship beneath my hands. It was exactly what Grandpa envisioned. The conservation success drew state-level attention, and our water quality testing program won an Environmental Stewardship Award. The lake became a model for community-led preservation, and other waterfront groups started asking my advice on balancing growth with protecting the environment. Personally, I learned something unexpected about healing. My ex-wife reached out after reading about the events in the paper, impressed that I'd handled it with dignity instead of bitterness. We're not getting back together, but we're talking again, and that matters for our family. I finally gave my grandson that fishing lesson I'd promised him. Watching him cast his first line from the same dock where 4 generations of Morrison men had learned the skill was worth every second of Linda's harassment. The Morrison Family Scholarship now awards $2,500 annually to local students pursuing environmental science degrees. 3 recipients so far have sent heartfelt thank you letters, which sit on my kitchen table next to Grandpa's old coffee mug. Property values in the area actually went up after the legal disputes were resolved. Some buyers were drawn specifically by our conservation efforts and cooperative spirit. The marina's business rose by 15%, boosted by positive publicity and fishing guide referrals. Sometimes I sit on the dock at sunset, watching the water turn gold and feeling Grandpa's presence in the breeze. I've learned that defending your principles doesn't just protect your rights. It can strengthen an entire community when people realize bulls don't have to win. The old-timers still stop by for coffee and stories, and Earl has become a minor local legend, always ready to remind people that patience and preparation beat bluster every time. The best part came last month when a waterfront owner from the next county called about an HOA dispute that sounded all too familiar. Their president had been charging fees for permits she didn't control. Some people never learn. Drop a comment with your worst HOA nightmare. I read them all, and some are downright unbelievable. If standing up to petty tyrants resonates with you, hit that subscribe button, because next week's story is about an HOA president who tried to foreclose on a disabled veteran's home and found out why you never cross someone who knows explosives.